Picture this. December 25th, 1991. The red flag comes down from the Kremlin for the last time. Cameras roll. The world celebrates the end of the Cold War. Democracy wins, communism loses. Roll credits. Except that's not really what happened. While everyone was watching the political theater, the real story was playing out in a bunch of ledger books that nobody wanted to talk about. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of ideology or revolution or some grand clash of civilizations. It went broke, stone cold, bankrupt. This is the story of how a superpower with 40,000 nuclear warheads couldn't afford to buy bread. Before we dive deeper into how a nuclear empire managed to overdraft its own future, consider hitting subscribe so you can follow more of these economic autopsies before your own money gets caught in the next version of this story. Now, if you believe the official story, the Soviet collapse was about freedom versus tyranny. Ronald Reagan told Gorbachev to tear down that wall, and somehow democracy just magically prevailed. The media sold it as a triumph of Western values. Politicians took credit for winning the Cold War through superior ideology and military strength. Even today, most people think the USSR fell apart because communism was inherently flawed or because the people rose up demanding liberty. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Soviet Union was essentially a giant oil company masquerading as a country. And when oil prices crashed, so did their entire empire. The whole freedom versus communism narrative was just the story we told ourselves, because it felt better than admitting we watched a nuclear superpower go bankrupt in real time. The real story starts with what looked like the luckiest break in Russian history. In 1965, Soviet geologists were poking around the frozen wasteland of western Siberia when they hit the jackpot. They discovered the Samotlor oil field, and this wasn't just any oil field. This was essentially an underground ocean of crude oil. At the time, it seemed like divine intervention. The Soviet economy was already showing cracks. Their factories were pumping out cars that barely ran and televisions that exploded. Consumer goods were a joke. But suddenly, none of that mattered. Why build decent cars when you can just drill holes in the ground and sell what comes out? The timing couldn't have been better. Throughout the 70s, oil prices went absolutely insane. The OPEC embargo sent energy costs through the roof, and the Soviets became the biggest winners in this global energy casino. Billions of dollars in hard currency started flooding into Moscow. It was the greatest lottery win in Russian history. But here's the thing about lottery winners. They tend to make some really stupid decisions with their windfall. The oil money was like a drug. It made all the Soviet Union's problems disappear, at least on paper. Why reform the broken factories when oil revenue can subsidize everything? Why fix the disaster that was Soviet agriculture when you can just sell oil and buy food? The leadership in the Kremlin used this windfall to buy social peace. They kept bread prices artificially low through massive subsidies. They subsidized housing so people could afford rent. They propped up their satellite states in Eastern Europe with cheap energy and favorable trade deals. They built a military machine that consumed 20% of their entire economic output. But this golden age was built on quicksand. The entire stability of the Soviet system became pegged to one number: the price of a barrel of oil. As long as crude stayed above $30, they were invincible. They could invade Afghanistan, threaten Europe, and race America to the moon. The Kremlin looked at their oil charts and convinced themselves the party would last forever. Meanwhile, something embarrassing was happening that nobody wanted to talk about. The Soviet Union, which controlled some of the most fertile farmland on Earth in Ukraine, couldn't feed its own people. The collective farm system was so spectacularly inefficient that half the potatoes would rot in the fields before anyone could figure out how to get them to a store. Think about that for a second. a nuclear superpower that couldn't manage basic agriculture, so they had to buy grain, millions of tons of it. And the cruel irony? They were buying it from their supposed enemy, the United States. By the early 80s, the Soviets were spending nearly half their hard currency earnings just to import wheat to keep their people from starving. They were literally selling oil to the West so they could buy food from the West. It was the most humiliating dependency cycle in geopolitical history. But the guys in the Kremlin weren't worried. They looked at their oil revenue projections and saw nothing but blue skies ahead. They had no idea they were about to face the perfect economic storm. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. Young, energetic, full of ideas about modernizing the Soviet system. He announced this grand plan called perestroika, restructuring the economy to make it competitive again. To fund this massive investment program, he looked at the budget and naturally assumed the oil money would keep flowing. That assumption was about to destroy everything. On September 13, 1985, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani made an announcement that would change the course of history. Saudi Arabia was tired of restricting production to keep oil prices high. They were going to flood the market with cheap crude. The result was an absolute massacre. Oil prices went from $35 a barrel in 1980 to $10 by 1986. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't just an economic setback. This was a death sentence. Imagine losing half your salary overnight, but your mortgage, car payments, and grocery bills all stayed exactly the same. That's what happened to the Soviet budget. Tens of billions of dollars just evaporated. And this happened at literally the worst possible moment. They were stuck in a costly war in Afghanistan, burning through millions of dollars every day. They were propping up communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. They were trying to match America's Star Wars missile defense program, and they still had to buy grain because their own farms were useless. The grain ships kept arriving in Odessa every week, demanding payment in hard currency. Dollars or gold, not rubles, because the ruble was what economists call a soft currency. It was basically monopoly money outside Soviet borders. You couldn't use rubles to buy American wheat or German machinery. You needed real money. So Gorbachev faced an impossible choice. Cut military spending and anger the generals. Cut food subsidies and anger the people. Or borrow money and hope things got better. He chose option 3, and it was catastrophic. The Soviet Union started taking massive loans from Western banks. German banks, French banks, British banks. They were all happy to lend money to a nuclear superpower. After all, countries don't go bankrupt, right? The Soviets had perfect credit ratings and legendary gold reserves. They seemed like the safest bet in the world. But this wasn't investment capital being used to build profitable factories. This was survival money. The Soviets were borrowing billions just to buy food and consumer goods to prevent complete social collapse. It was a national credit card spiral. They were borrowing money to eat. Then Gorbachev made a domestic policy decision that accelerated the disaster. He launched an anti-alcohol campaign because vodka was destroying the health of Soviet workers. Morally, it was probably the right thing to do. Economically, it was suicide. The tax on vodka was one of the largest sources of government revenue, second only to oil. By restricting alcohol sales, Gorbachev wiped out another huge chunk of the budget. And the people didn't stop drinking. They just started making moonshine at home. So the government got zero revenue from alcohol, and sugar disappeared from stores because everyone was buying it to brew illegal liquor. The budget deficit spiraled completely out of control. By 1988, the government started doing the one thing you should never do in an economic crisis. They turned on the printing presses, they started printing rubles to pay workers' wages. But since there were no goods in stores to buy, all this printed money just piled up. This created what economists call monetary overhang. People had pockets full of cash, but the shelves were empty. The shortage economy kicked into high gear. People would stand in line for 4 hours just to buy a loaf of bread. If you saw a line forming, you'd join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be shoes, sausages, or toilet paper. You grabbed whatever you could because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract was disintegrating. Soviet people had tolerated the lack of political freedom because the state provided economic stability. Cheap rent, guaranteed food, job security. Now that stability was evaporating, the shelves were bare, money was worthless, and the West was watching nervously. Banks in London and Frankfurt started getting suspicious. They noticed the Soviet Union was borrowing money just to pay interest on previous loans. The debt had exploded from essentially zero to $50 billion in just a few years. The bankers realized the emperor had no clothes, and more importantly, he had no cash. By 1989, the Soviet economy wasn't just struggling, it was disintegrating in real time. The Berlin Wall fell. The satellite states in Eastern Europe broke free. To the world, this looked like political liberation, but to the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade within a closed economic loop. Now these countries demanded payment in dollars for their goods. The entire trading system collapsed overnight. Panic set in at the Kremlin. The legendary gold reserves started vanishing. In the mid-'80s, the Soviets had tons of gold bars sitting in vaults. By 1990, they were secretly flying gold to London and Zurich, selling it frantically just to pay for the next shipment of wheat. They sold so much gold so quickly that they actually depressed the global price, getting even less value for their desperation sales. Then came the War of Laws. This was the final internal blow. Soviet republics like Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states started withholding tax revenue from the central government. Boris Yeltsin, leader of the Russian Republic, told his tax collectors to keep the money local instead of sending it to Gorbachev. The Central Soviet budget just evaporated. Gorbachev was president of a nuclear superpower, but he had no income. He commanded thousands of nuclear missiles, but couldn't pay the guards who watched them. In 1990, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union started defaulting on commercial payments. Ships full of frozen meat and dairy products anchored off the coast of Leningrad refused to dock. The captains radioed that they wouldn't unload cargo until payments cleared. But the checks were bouncing. The Soviet government had to go begging for humanitarian aid from the very countries they'd spent decades threatening with nuclear annihilation. The nation that had defeated Hitler and put the first human in space was now asking Germany for care packages of powdered milk and canned beef. It was beyond humiliating. The Soviet Foreign Trade Bank froze all accounts. Companies that had earned hard currency through international trade woke up to find their accounts empty. The state had confiscated their money to pay national debts. It was theft on a massive scale, and it destroyed any remaining trust in the system. The ruble stopped functioning as actual money. The economy switched to pure barter. Factories paid workers in whatever they produced, tires or crystal glasses or industrial equipment. Workers would stand on roadsides trying to trade a set of tires for a bag of potatoes. The black market became the only real market. The dollar became the only currency that mattered. Taxi drivers and waiters were suddenly part of the new elite because they had access to foreign cash. University professors and nuclear scientists became paupers. In August 1991, communist hardliners launched a coup against Gorbachev. They parked tanks in Red Square, wanting to restore order and turn back the clock. But they forgot something crucial. You can't shoot economics. The coup leaders had no plan to fix the debt or put food on store shelves. The coup collapsed not just because people resisted, but because the plotters realized they were fighting for the captain's chair on the Titanic, and the ship was already underwater. When Gorbachev returned to power after the failed coup, he was essentially a ghost. Real power had shifted to Yeltsin and the individual republics, but the debt remained. Western banks and the G7 nations called an emergency meeting. They were terrified. The Soviet Union owed nearly $70 billion. If the country broke apart, who would pay? They demanded a joint responsibility agreement from all the republics. Someone had to sign for this massive debt. In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money for worker payrolls. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, producing banknotes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived with a vengeance. December 1991 marked the end of the line. The Central Bank of the Soviet Union was completely insolvent. They had literally run out of gold. Those legendary reserves, rumored to contain thousands of tons, were gone. Investigators later found only about 240 tons remaining in the vaults. The rest had been sold, stolen, or wasted in desperate attempts to keep the system running for just one more month. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk to sign his resignation. He wasn't resigning because he'd been conquered by an invading army. He was resigning because he'd lost the ability to write checks that wouldn't bounce. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, but its financial ghost lingered in ledger books around the world. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherited the UN Security Council seat, the nuclear codes, and the debt. All of it. Russia agreed to take on 100% of Soviet foreign debt in exchange for claiming all Soviet foreign assets, the embassies, and remaining gold reserves. It was called the Zero Option Deal. This debt burden crushed the new Russia throughout the 1990s. The democratic government was strangled by interest payments on loans taken out by the communists. The shock therapy economic reforms that followed were a direct result of this bankruptcy. There was no money to cushion the transition from communism to capitalism. Subsidies were eliminated overnight. Food prices skyrocketed by 2,000%. The life savings of millions of ordinary Russians were wiped out in days. The poverty that followed was horrific. But it wasn't caused by the collapse of 1991. It was caused by the oil addiction of the 1970s. The pain of the 90s was the withdrawal symptom from the oil high. Russia defaulted again in 1998, crashing global markets. It took until the 2000s, when oil prices rose again, for the debts to finally get cleared. In 2017, Russia made the final payment on Soviet-era debt, a payment to Bosnia and Herzegovina. It took 26 years to close the books on a dead empire. The fall of the Soviet Union is the ultimate cautionary tale about the resource curse. It teaches us that natural resources aren't the same as economic strength. The Soviets thought they were rich because they had oil. They confused luck with genius. They used easy money to mask structural problems, buy social peace, and hide inefficiencies. They built a superpower on a foundation of commodities and pegged their survival to a number on a trading screen in London. When that number dropped, nuclear warheads couldn't save them. The secret police couldn't save them. Communist ideology couldn't save them. An empire that can't pay for its bread isn't really an empire. It's a ticking time bomb. In the end, the Cold War wasn't won by missiles or superior ideology. It was won by a grain shipment the Soviets couldn't afford to buy. The hammer and sickle didn't fall to democracy. It went bankrupt. So what can we learn from this spectacular financial disaster? First, never build your entire economy around a single commodity, no matter how valuable it seems. Second, when times are good, that's exactly when you should be preparing for when times get bad. And third, easy money has a way of making you forget how to do hard work. The Soviet story shows us what happens when a society becomes addicted to unearned wealth and forgets how to create real value. Whether it's oil, tech bubbles, or housing booms, the pattern is always the same. Easy money masks problems until the money runs out, and then reality hits like a freight train. If this breakdown of how a superpower quietly went bankrupt made something click for you about spotting the next big economic failure, consider subscribing so you are not the last one to understand what just happened when the next system cracks.